Hi, everybody. I'm David Highfill. I'm on the board of the Spencertown Academy and very happy to welcome you today to our virtual 2021 Festival of Books. We're very fortunate today to have two authors with us to talk about their work, Sonia Purnell and Clare Mulley. Sonia is here to talk about A Woman of No Importance, the unknown history of an American spy who helped win World War II. How's that for a subtitle? And Clare is here to talk about her book, The Spy Who Loved, The Secrets and Lives of Christine Granville. Sonia Purnell is the author of a biography of Boris Johnson, and Clementine, a biography of Winston Churchill's wife, about the vital role she played in her husband's career. And about A Woman of No Importance, the New York Times Book Review said, it's as riveting as any thriller and as hard to put down. USA Today called it an incredible story of underappreciated heroism. Sonia has written for many national newspapers in the UK, as well as the Wall Street Journal, among others. She lives in London with her family. Clare Mulley is an award-winning author and broadcaster. She is the author of The Woman Who Saved Children, the biography of Eglantine Jebb, and the Women Who Flew for Hitler. Clare is a regular contributor to TV history series for BBC and writes and reviews nonfiction for The Telegraph and other media. We're also going to have Q&A following their discussion. Feel free to submit questions at any time via the Q&A button on the information bar at the bottom of your screen. Also remember that we have a specialty online bookstore. Proceeds for this book sale and donations go to the Academy programming and our budget. So these events and the funds they raise are crucial for us. So thank you for checking that out. Please visit us on the web at spencertownacademy.org for information about the book sale and other Festival of Books programs and more. Please join me in welcoming Sonia and Clare. I want to start out by asking each of you to sort of give us an overview of these two books, these two extraordinary women and the conflict, World War II, and their stories. Just give us an overview. Sonia, do you want to start?
Yes, well, I suppose, I had a close connection with the Second World War. My father fought in it and was very gravely injured and had a great impact on my childhood. But I used to think for a long time that we knew everything we needed to know or could know about the Second World War. How wrong I was. And I kind of stumbled across Virginia's story, and it amazed me every single day. And people say, why did you write about her? And I said, well, she was a one-legged woman. She had a wooden leg. She called Cuthbert. She lost a leg in an appalling hunting accident. Despite this, her resilience, her ingenuity, her courage, her absolute resolve, integrity, plus actually that accident made her undoubtedly one of the greatest secret agents of all time. She started off as a completely untrained desk clerk from Baltimore, went off into the field in wartime France. Pretty much no one expected to see her again. After all, there she was, this untrained, one-legged desk clerk. But she not only survived, she really did help turn the tide of the war in France. She certainly kept Allied intelligence alive when so many agents were being captured and tortured and executed, and she saved many of them. It's almost, what didn't Virginia do? And when I talk to my kids about her, I say, look, remember, she proves that courage comes in many different forms and all sorts of surprising places. And often the people who make themselves out to be brave or claim great things talk a lot are the ones who often did the least. Virginia didn't talk about what she did, which made my job of writing about it super difficult, but I'm really glad I did, because she was astonishing, formidable. She's an inspiration in my life every single day, and with a lot of my friends too. In fact, if I find myself in some challenging situation, I often say to myself, well, what would Virginia have done? She's almost sort of like this mentor to me from a past life. So she is someone who is a formidable figure that we should all know about. And there is now going to be a young adult version of the book, because I've had so many inquiries from high schools wanting me to speak or help them with their projects, their history projects, because she is someone who can teach us so much about our life today, even though, of course, she was in the field some 80 years ago, but she was a modern figure, super modern figure back then, when women were not expected to go and do things like blow up bridges or do huge mass jailbreaks or set up networks or actually, yes, kill the enemy. She did all of those, as I discovered, but as I say, she never boasted about it. And I think it was a surprise to some of her family. Well, I know it was a surprise to her family what I managed to discover, and it was certainly a surprise to me and to many others as well.
Claire, tell us about Claire, Christine Granville.
Okay, well, Christine Granville was another female special agent with the Special Operations Executive, as was Virginia Hall. And well, the book is called The Spy Who Loved because Christine was a very passionate woman. She did love adrenaline and adventure. One of the British ministers out in Europe said she had a pathological love of danger. She loved men. She had 2 husbands and many lovers, many of whom she served with in the war. She served in 3 different theatres of the war. So she had a lot of compatriots to work with, and not just compatriots, British and American as well. But above all, she loved freedom. And I think that's what really drove her, by which I mean both freedom for the country of her birth, which was Poland, and freedom for the country that she adopted after the war, which was Britain. She served she served Britain directly during the war for 6 years, the entire course of the war. But also freedom for herself personally. And she was a woman very much ahead of her times in that regard. So she wanted a life of action and adventure. And perhaps it's ironic that what is generally considered to be a very male sphere, war, is what enabled her to take centre stage. So she was born, as I said, in Poland. She was a Polish countess. She was a pre-war beauty queen as well. Not all of the special agents were beautiful. They came in every single shape and form and age and nationality and faith and no faith. But she was beautiful. She grew up with a lot of freedom and adoration, riding horses and shooting guns. But because her mother had been born Jewish, she was never really accepted in the higher echelons of Polish society, as in so many societies, unfortunately, especially in the 1930s, there was considerable anti-Semitism, I'm sad to say. But in a sense, she grew up having to fight her corner, and this gave her a lot of resilience and determination as well. So when war came, she was actually stranded in Britain when war came, and she didn't really volunteer, she demanded to be taken on by, SOE hadn't been set up then, the Special Operations Executive, so she demanded to be taken on for the men in the offices, supposedly secret offices of the British Secret Services. And I think they were astounded because, first of all, she wasn't British at that point. They gave her, or she soon received, British citizenship. And above all, she was a woman, and no women were in that role at all until Christine was appointed. And it was only because she was so successful and achieved so much in that role that was one of the contributory factors for bringing other women in. So they brought her in, and one of the first memos I read about her really summed her up for me. Said she was a Polish patriot, flaming Polish patriot, an expert skier and a great adventuress, as well as being absolutely fearless. But what I liked was one of those men had written in pencil in the margin, they said, "Oh, she terrifies me." So I think that gives a sort of an early insight into her great character. So then she served in occupied Poland, the first occupied country, if you don't count Germany itself. So she served in Poland, skiing in over the high Tatra mountains, to taking in information and bringing back microfilm and coding books and all that sort of thing. And this is in minus 40 degrees, it's absolutely appalling conditions, even if you're not being shot at by the enemy. And she was arrested twice. I don't know if we're going to come into some of these stories later. I won't tell them all now, but she managed to talk her way out or creatively create opportunities to get not only herself, but also the men she was serving with out from being arrested. And And she brought out one of her early achievements in the war. She smuggled out some of the microfilms showing the massing of troops and tanks on the German side of the German-Soviet border, which was the first film evidence of Operation Barbarossa, when Hitler betrayed his erstwhile ally Stalin, and their forces would soon go on to invade Soviet territory. And this is what prompted Winston Churchill to call her his favourite spy at this point in the war. But that was just the first theatre of the war she served in. She served, as I said, in 3 different theatres. She was the longest serving, not just female special agent, but the longest serving special agent for Britain, male or female, and one of the most high achieving. So she went on to serve in Egypt and the Middle East, and then was parachuted down behind enemy lines in Nazi occupied France to support preparations for D-Day in the south of France, which is where the American forces were mainly coming in. And incredible achievements there. I think we'll talk a bit about those later. And I just wanted to say, like Sonia, you know, I feel that we often hear the male stories, and we hear that is the war story, but actually there is this rich seam of untold women's stories, and that's partly what attracted me to Christina's story. The fact that I think all too often when we hear about female special agents or women in the resistance more generally, it tends to be in very romantic terms. You know, we hear about their courage rather than their achievements. And Christina's story, I hope, for me, it does 2 things. It highlights the role, the use and perhaps the abuse at some points of Poland in the war, because it's often said in Britain that Britain stood alone, but in fact, we always had allies, and Poland was the first among the allies. But also the role of women. I hope it helps us to reevaluate the effectiveness of women in the role, as well as their courage and sacrifice.
One thing I love about both of these women is the quality of, you know, we talk about self-starters, people who have the motivation, the interest, the will to do things on their own. And I think that both of these women showed that to a degree, and they kind of made their role. They weren't, I mean, as you say, Christine walks into the office of the intelligence services 2 years before SOE and says, give me a job. I have an idea for how to help Polish nationals. And Virginia, you know, at some point, you know, says, you know, I can still do this. I don't have one of my legs, but I can do this. Her wooden leg could not pivot at the ankles. So she, you know, her walking was so noticeable and couldn't have been easy, but yet she did not let that stop her. You know, all to say, I feel like these women learned on the job. No one trained them to be a special agent. Am I right about that? That they just sort of went into behind the lines, into France, into Poland, and Christine's part, and just sort of created it. So can you talk a little about the bravery and the sheer kind of chutzpah to just go in? When Virginia started, Sonia, you know, how did she do that? She was confident she could do it, right?
Yes, I mean, goodness knows where that confidence came from, because the reason why she went in largely untrained is because they didn't really know what they were doing at this point. The main example that they drew on was actually the IRA against the British occupiers in Ireland, where you had what was seen as an occupying force. You had people who were not organized soldiers or anything, but were fighting back. But they were in their own country. They formed cells, are very effective, but they were in their own country. Virginia was going into a completely different country, occupied by a foreign power. And they simply didn't know at that point how to set up networks in a foreign country with all these sort of, you know, hostile authorities that there were. So she had to pretty much make it up as she went along. Now, lucky for all of us, she was really, really good at this. And the reason why I think, well, many reasons why I think her accent made her a formidable special agent was she was used to being on her own, relying on her own, being the other, if you like, not being part of a group, because you couldn't trust anybody. You simply couldn't trust anybody. There was an agent who had dinner in front of the mirror because her reflection was the only person that she could trust. And that was literally how it was. But a lot of agents, big, you know, butch bravado type of agents, fell by the wayside because they simply couldn't cope with the loneliness of the mental and physical discipline. Virginia somehow could, and I do think that her disability, her accident, her past helped her here. And the techniques that she pioneered back in 1941, 1942, 41, even before Pearl Harbor. So America wasn't in the war yet, and yet she had volunteered to do this with SOE. Those techniques of creating discrete cells of people, giving them hope, giving them confidence, organizing them, drilling them, disciplining them, are still used by the CIA today. Now, how do I know that? Because I went and spent a day at Langley, which was terrific fun, very exciting, by the way. And they told me, I mean, they gave me an example of Operation Jawbreaker in Afghanistan. That's around the turn of the millennium, just coming into our century, where Virginia's techniques were used. So the incredible thing is that what Virginia kind of made up, there was no rule book, there was no training, was so good it's in use today. And I've met one or two CIA trainers, and they say, yeah, sure, we talk about Virginia and what she did. But where did that resolve come from? Where did that confidence come from? And I think, when she lost her leg, her mother expected her just to live a quiet life, sitting in a chair in the corner from now on. Her mother had always wanted her to sort of marry well, marry money, marry sort of high society family. She'd gone against that. She'd now lost her leg. Her mother just wanted her home. This was obviously before the war. But Virginia wanted, I think, she desperately wanted to prove, A, why she'd survived an accident no one actually expected her to survive, but B, what she could still do. What could she do that was great? What could she prove could still be done with only one leg? And I reckon, when most of us would think, this is too dangerous, I don't have to do this, my country's not even involved in this yet, most of us would think, well, maybe I won't. But Virginia thought, maybe I will. And she did, and she came up with solutions. She was a really good problem solver. I mean, that's not a term that people used back then, but that's what she was. She was ingenious. And you talk about her ankle, so it couldn't flex, going up and down steps or hills, really difficult. When she was working for the State Department as a clerk, and they sent her to Venice. I don't know whether you've been to Venice, but there are 400 little bridges that go up and go down, and her job was to get around town a lot. And it was impossible as a pretty new amputee then. So she came up with a solution, and that was to buy a gondola and to get a local guy by the name of Angelo to teach her how to get about town in a gondola. And I think you get a little flavor there of Virginia before the war. A problem, here's a solution. And that's what she did. And she wasn't going to take no for an answer. So she really was a pioneer and someone who is talked about in the CIA today. And she did work at the CIA after the war. They didn't treat her very well, which they do now admit. But her legacy, lives on. And I'm doing whatever I can to help that happen.
Well, I know the book is that they've all read it by now, right? They should be using it, I would think, the CIA.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, funny enough, a friend of mine went to a kind of a lecture the other day given by someone from the CIA, and went up at the end and said, oh, my friend wrote the book about Virginia Hall, and this intelligence officer from the CIA said, oh, well, yeah, we all read it. Yeah, fantastic. So I'm hoping there it's on the shelves. And there's a big painting of Virginia. It's the first thing you see in this big corridor in Langley, is this huge painting of her making a radio broadcast during the war. So I mean, that was rather fun for me to see. And it's great how they talk about her now. It's taken a long time to get to that point, but we're getting there.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Claire, tell us a little bit about how Christine started. So one of her initial plans was to take some information from the British into Poland. This is very early in the war, right? Yeah. And yeah. Poland has already been run over by Germany. That's the outset, right? But she says, I have a plan, I can do this.
That's right.
So she had people that she knew that she thought she could be in touch with, but she
Yeah.
wasn't, she couldn't have been positive, right? Was she sure about about her plan?
Well, when war broke out, she was actually in Southern Africa with her second husband, who was a diplomat, but they turned the ship around. Eventually they came back and disembarked in southern England, in Southampton. And within days, she's made her way to the MI6's offices. And like I said, was demanding to be taken on. And her plan was to take in information, propaganda, money for the fledgling Polish resistance, which started organizing very quickly. And of course, Nazi Germany invaded on the 1st of September. The Soviet Union, of course, we mustn't forget, invaded on the 17th of September. So Poland was fighting on two fronts immediately. And of course, they, as we know, they were occupied, but a large number of the Polish forces managed to get overseas and rejoin the fight. But Christine, yes, was taking in money to support and information to support the fledgling resistance. Then she was doing her own research around the country, I suppose sort of espionage work, but basically looking at the troop movements, looking at how the Nazis were organizing in that part of Poland, because the Allies were desperate to find out how things ran in the first country that had been occupied. This was hugely important intelligence. And the way she did it was she, before the war, when she was still married to her first husband, who was a soft furnishings magnate, I just knew that that was never going to last with her. She used to go skiing a lot, and she was actually a brilliant skier in the Zakopane. And from there, you can get over across the borders. And she used to leave all the men far behind. And then after a while, she got bored with that. So she used to smuggle cigarettes across the border. I think she must have been one of the few women in the 1930s that didn't actually smoke herself. She wasn't doing it for that. She wasn't doing it for money. She was just doing it for fun, for the thrill of it. But it meant that she knew the smuggling routes and also the mountain people, the Goral people, who were some of the first to organize resistance. So she knew how to get in and out. She had the right languages. She had the right contacts. So when there, she knew she could move around the nation and gather information. And then she would come back. And as I said, she made 4 of these extraordinary trips across the mountains. But she was actually captured on her last trip over with an count, actually, Vladimir Ledechowski, who was also a courier for the Poles. Christine was working for the British, but he was working for the Poles, but they were following the same route. And in fact, thrown together in circumstances of extreme danger, they were very close on their mission. And then they were arrested, unfortunately, and they were being marched down from the mountains to a police station in a village. And this perhaps gives you a little insight into Christine as well. At one point, they were held by 2 armed guards. And Vladimir, his main concern was how he could possibly share some of the cyanide powder he had in his pockets with Christine before they were taken for interrogation, because he knew that would probably be quite brutal. And his biggest fear was that they would share some of the information, the identity of the people they were working with in Poland. But Christine's thoughts were running in a different direction. She had realized that these 2 armed guards were actually now taking everything out of her bag, laying it down in the wet grass to see what they had, except when they came to bundles of money. And she had all these different bundles of money to give to different parts of the resistance. And then these 2 men just divided it up between them and put it in their pockets. So she knew that they weren't motivated. I mean, very quick thinking. She knew they weren't motivated just by ideology or politics, but by greed. And she was wearing under her shirt a cut glass necklace that Vladimir had actually given to her as a love token. But now she got it out and started fiddling with it as if, you know, she was going, oh, my diamonds, as if she was agitated. And these guards reached for her necklace and they were distracted. And when they did so, she pulled the chain and the beads fell into the wet grass, and the 2 guards fell on their knees trying to find these diamonds, kicked the gun out of the way, and they pegged it to the forest. I mean, to have the blunt courage, but also the quick thinking, the sang-froid in that moment to come up with it. And Christine's always wins. I mean, later she was arrested again and taken for interrogation with another gentleman, Andrzej Kowerski, who also had just one leg, actually, who was her soulmate, and they worked together throughout the war. And they were being interrogated, and she, at this point, had a hacking cough, and she decided to make a virtue of this, to look as if she was ill. And what she did was she bit her own tongue. I mean, hard and repeatedly. I can't imagine doing it myself, but in these circumstances, until her mouth filled with blood. And when she coughed, of course, it looked as if she was coughing up blood, which is the symptoms of tuberculosis. And the Germans were rightly terrified of this disease. You know, it's carried by water droplets. Basically, interrogation and TB do not mix very well. So they threw her and Andrew out, believing correctly that he was her lover. And later we find, when SOE is later established, in one of their handbooks for trainees, I mean, this reflects what Sonia was saying, they were making it up as they went. They actually put under interrogation, this is a really good ruse, bite your tongue, spit out blood. And this became one of the operational tactics that the men were trained in, that was pioneered by Christine's quick thinking. So yes, all of this does filter through.
Amazing, amazing. Sonia, here's something I want to ask you about, and it's without giving it away, because people are going to leave this discussion for both of you and want to read both of these books, but there is, a section where Virginia has reached a certain pinnacle. She's running hundreds of agents. I believe she's in Lyon. Is this right? And she has several cells, several networks. She's incredibly well organized. It seems like she is in control and responsible for just an enormous amount of money, material coming in, running these cells, finding new agents, bucking up and supporting those agents who are afraid and scared and whatever. She really seems like a modern CEO. And then someone who infiltrates her circle, resistance circle, is a priest, and he's a pretty suspicious guy. There's some questions about him. There are questions about everybody, right, that she meets and she works with. She's always wondering who's the double agent. But it turns out that this guy is a very formidable opponent, and indeed is not on her side. It's just the most dramatic chapter, series of chapters in her life and her success. Can you talk a little bit about that story without maybe saying the ending of it all, but just, I was fascinated by your ability to really put us in the room. So I felt like I knew this guy. Anyway, could you talk a bit about that guy?
Yes, I mean, Virginia was a victim of her success. I mean, what she gets up to comes ultimately to the notice of Hitler himself. He knows that there is basically a super agent in France who, amongst many other things at this point, has managed to rescue 12 agents from a prison camp. And the secret files that I found in London described that, quote, stupefaction that anyone had been able to do this. I mean, if you think about the film The Great Escape, we know that those guys got out of the camp, but then they were all pretty much rounded up or shot or whatever it was. She got them all over the mountains into Spain and back to Britain. Every single one of them made it. But, do we hear about that? No. But so that comes to Hitler's attention. He knows that there is this super spy in Lyon. Initially, I think it's a man, then they realize it's a woman. But both the Gestapo and the Abwehr, which is German military intelligence, they got some pretty clever people, particularly the Abwehr. They're closing in on Virginia. And their secret weapon is this priest, Robert Alesh, who I'm afraid was one of the most successful double agents in France of the war. I mean, incredibly evil man. His evil is kind of really beyond comprehension, particularly considering he was a priest. And of course, some people were kind of taken in. He was a man of the cloth, although he did amazingly have a German accent. But he explained that was because he came from the border region between France and Germany. So it wasn't totally, unexpected that someone who was French could have a German accent. But he manages to wheedle his way into the headquarters of her entire network, and she sees him there, and then he opens his mouth with this German accent. You can imagine that she freezes, but he arrives at what looks like the most incredible intelligence of German fortifications, coastal fortifications, to send back to London, which, remember at this point is the world center of planning the Second World War. I mean, that intelligence was doctored by the Germans. Actually, it was worse than useless. It was misleading, but she's not to know that. But she did, like all successful agents, have the sixth sense. It was like her antennae were going, okay, so this guy's coming up with really great photographs and information, but there's something about him that's not quite right. And she signals London, and they say to her, well, you know, we've tried to check him out, we don't know who he is, so keep your distance. But he keeps on arriving with what looks like great intelligence. And she thinks, okay, I can handle this. So I'm going to go on taking the photographs for him. But of course, he's getting closer and closer and closer, and bringing in the Germans with him closer and closer and closer. Now, she realizes at one point, eventually, she cannot just tough it out anymore. I mean, London keeps trying to call her out, but she says, no, I can handle this, I can handle this. And finally, she realizes she's got literally minutes to get out of Lyon onto a train. And then remember, Cuthbert, the leg, the only way out, Gestapo behind her, is over the mountains, a very high mountain pass from France to Spain, over the Pyrenees, in some of the worst snowstorms for 200 years. And she has to do it. Remember, the ankle doesn't flex either way. She had to do it sideways up and sideways down in huge winds, nothing to hold on to, no snowshoes. She's wearing normal shoes, but even worse than that, she's with 3 men. She cannot let on about Cuthbert, because often these guys who were doing these trips, if they thought you were going to slow them down and get them shot, they would push you into a ravine or shoot you in the back of the head. So she can't say anything. She just has to keep up with him. So later she says that was the worst moment of the war. And I won't tell you what happens after or during that crossing, but she does manage to get away at that point and comes back eventually into France. But by this point, she is the Gestapo's most wanted agent in Europe, and they know her face completely. So she has to come back in heavy disguise. And this is the extent of her commitment. She comes back as a French peasant, someone who would look about 30, 35 years older than she was. She's in her mid-30s by this point. So how does she do this? She gets Hollywood makeup artists to teach her how to draw wrinkles onto her face. So effective and realistic, by the way, that German officers would come right up to her. Remember, they have photographs of her and still not recognize her as Virginia Hall. But that's not enough. She also gets a totally ferocious sounding female dentist in London to grind down her beautiful white American teeth so that they look like French peasant teeth. And she dyes her hair, she wears lots of extra clothing so she looks stouter and things. But ultimately that disguise is the only thing between her and death. Because if they stop her anyway, any of the patrols, she has this wooden leg. They know about the wooden leg by this point. So she is so vulnerable, and that's all she has. But she insists on going back into France. The Brits won't send her. They say it's too dangerous. No way. We can't send you. So at this point, she then starts working for the Americans, who are just desperate for anyone with field experience, because the Americans, comparatively at this point in the war, are sort of quite ingenue in this sort of dirty war, this secret war, if you like, where normal rules of engagement don't apply. So she manages to persuade them to send her in as this French peasant. But I think that gives you, a flavor of her commitment, but also the dangers that she faced. And that priest, by the way, never gives up, ever, right to the end of the war. He's always after her because she is this big bounty. So I'm not going to tell you what happens, but he was a formidable figure, but just a very, very dark and evil one. And very few figures in the war, I think, individually did as much damage as he did. The other person, by the way, who was after her for the whole time was someone you might have heard of, the butcher of Lyon, Gestapo chief called Klaus Barbie, who was just a mass murderer, and he was obsessed with her and said he would do anything to get his hands on her. So, her adversaries were formidable. She had to always be one step ahead of them, otherwise she wasn't going to survive.
Right. And she escapes that priest and Barbie in that instance by going to Spain. But then there's like, 300 more pages of the book. I mean, more adventures. I mean, she just,
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of like part one. I mean, when she comes back, it's a very different sort of mission she's on. She's no longer setting up networks, getting agents out of jail, bringing in, sending back information. She's doing all of those things still, but now she's actually a guerrilla fighter. She still hasn't had training. She has a manual, like something you might read when you get a new computer or something, literally, again, having to make it up as she went along, but was able ultimately to surround an entire German garrison in the Haute-Loire down in southern France through blowing up bridges and phone cables and roads and things. And eventually, that entire German garrison surrender because there's nothing that they can do. And of course, she didn't do it by herself. That would be ridiculous. But I think all of the people who were involved in that, there wasn't a single professional soldier, by the way. The armies were still stuck up in Normandy, fighting the Germans up there. But she equipped them with 22 parachute drops. She directed them, she trained them, and she commanded them. And bit by bit, as I say, they isolated, cut off that German garrison. And so the Haute-Loire, where she was one of the first French départements that was liberated outside Normandy. And by the time the French army arrived, and they think they're going to have to fight their way in, they just kind of just walk in. It's like a picnic for them. I think pretty much everyone was amazed by that. And that's why ultimately she was put up for the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the second highest medal in America, as I'm sure you know, and she was the only civilian woman in the entire World War II to be so honored. And President Truman, FDR, had died by now, wanted to give it to her personally with a big ceremony in the White House, and she wrote to him, very Virginia this, and said, "Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for your invitation, but no, thank you, Mr. President. You see, I want to go on being a secret agent after the war, and I can't afford to have that kind of publicity. And anyway, I want to stay busy. So let me stay in the field, please." I think Truman was astonished by this, as were a lot of people. But that was very Virginia. I mean, she never courted glory. She wanted respect. She didn't always get it. That's what she wanted rather than glory. And she never really got glory.
Claire, there's a story, not a story. This is part of what was true, but she was working with one of the best male SOE agents whose last name is Camar. I'm not sure. Is it a French?
Camert. Francis Camert.
Camert. Yes. And Camert I'd read about before, but kind of didn't know how long they worked together. And some of this culminates in the battle on this plateau, which was some of the French resistance groups of there were maybe 500 to 800 of them. So this was one of the major. This is Vercors. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, the Battle of Vercors is one of the major engagements of the French resistance, yeah.
Right,
yes,
which was incredibly sad, right? It did not end well. But Claire's ingenious kind of rescue of him. Can you talk about the Battle of Vercors?
Yeah, well, so this is when Christine was working in the third theatre of the war in which she served. So she had by now become one of the most highly trained female special agents. So she was trained in wireless transmitting, and people were told if you're going to be sent in as a wireless transmitter, you had potentially 6 weeks life expectancy, because the Germans had these tracker vehicles. They could latch onto that signal and identify. So they had to be incredibly fast while they're doing that. That wasn't her main focus, though. That was a sort of secondary skill she had. She was mainly going out to be a courier for Francis Camert, who was the sort of one of the big leaders of, well, he was an SOE leader, but coordinating the resistance in the south of France in preparation for D-Day in the south. But she also had some other missions specific to her to undertake as well. So she went out and met Francis, He is Michael Morpurgo's uncle, by the way, you know, the English children's author. And I asked Michael why he's never written about this. You know, he's written 800 stories, some of them in compilation books, but, you know, he's never touched on this and until recently. And he said, oh, it's just too close to him. But we spoke about it a lot. And one of his most recent books is called In the Mouth of the Wolf, which is what the peasants used to say. It means good luck, really, in the mountains between France and Italy. And so that story is now told for children as well, about Francis and Christine. But anyhow, so she was working with Francis in the Battle of Vercors, and they, unlike many of the French resistance fighters in this very brave and symbolic act, they survived, but the majority of them and a number of civilians, unfortunately, were killed on that plateau. It was a sort of last defeat of the Germans, really, in the area. Anyhow, they made their way down, and they had to get out because they had very specific plans of which roads to keep open, which roads to block with, you know, felling trees, and which telegraph wires to take out, and which trains to put sand in, and so on, to support the American invasionary forces coming in. And so they made their way out, and Christine then split up from Francis. He was doing his work, and she went off to undertake her mission in the mountains. And she actually managed to make the first contact between the French resistance on one side of the Alps and the Italian partisans on the other side of the Alps. She heard a battle, actually, and managed to circle round to the Italian side and took back a note of what he needed, which was uniforms and packed meat and shoes. That's what your partisan army needs, apparently. And then while she was up in the mountains, she also understood that there was a very strategic garrison on a pass in the Alps called the Col de l'Arche Pass, that the Americans wanted that pass opened. And this German garrison was holding it. But what she discovered was that a lot of the men at that garrison were actually Polish conscripts who were basically forced to hold that fort for the German leadership, the Nazi leadership at the fortress. And so she climbed up the mountain on her own, and she did. I mean, you said it was ridiculous for a woman to do it on her own, but she went up on her own and spoke to these Polish conscripts. And by the time she'd finished talking to them over several hours, I mean, she went up with a white and red scarf on to show the Poles. Had the German leadership in that garrison seen that, she would obviously have been taken out quite easily. She wasn't trying to hide herself. She was trying to make contact. She wanted to make contact with the Poles. And she did. And by the time she had finished talking to them, they had agreed a plan that a week later at a specific time, they would take down the mountain whatever small arms they could carry. They'd take out the breech blocks from the bigger guns and so on, so that the garrison would be left undefended. And only when they did this, completely according to the plan they'd worked out with Christine, then a couple of men went up and actually took the surrender of that garrison. So she did single-handedly secure the defection of this garrison on a strategic pass in the Alps. Then she got down the mountain and discovered that Francis Commerz and two other members of the resistance, a Frenchman and a Canadian, had been arrested and were actually due to be shot the next morning. And I'm going to take a leaf out of Sonia's book and not tell all the story, but she did love Francis, and she begged the French resistance, the cell in that area, to go and release them. But I think rightly they said they couldn't risk the men and guns, because part of her work had been to coordinate the dropping, the parachuting in of weapons, ammunition, and, you know, small motorbikes and so on for the work for D-Day. They couldn't risk the men and the equipment. So she got on a bicycle. She cycled off to the prison. She circled around, sung a love song till she heard Francis sung the chorus with her out a window. He thought it was like a farewell from her and thought that was lovely. But she then marched in to the Gestapo leader of the prison and basically demanded the release of Francis and the two other men. I won't tell you exactly how she did it, but again, I mean, she always said that her favourite weapon was her knife, and the course that she had excelled in was the silent killing course, which is killing with just a knife, a rope, or your bare hands. That's the one that she really stood out in. But in fact, unlike Virginia, we have no evidence that Christine killed anyone in the war. And in fact, I think her greatest weapon was her brain, because she goes in and she knows exactly which buttons to push, and she secures the release of all three men and herself. And then she carried on. So
amazing. I mean, just extraordinary stories, just extraordinary. Just a reminder to everybody, if you have some questions for Sonia or Claire, please put them in the Q&A chat and I will pick them up. So I'll be watching that. here's a general question for both of you. The research that you did was just voluminous. And so the idea of you organizing all of this, chronology is one thing, but still making both of these books read like a narrative and getting the sense that we know these two women is just quite an achievement. So congrats to both of you on that. But here's a question for you about records and what was saved and what wasn't saved. Why, when I wonder why these stories were forgotten, one example is, well, the story of war is written by men, so maybe they didn't want to save stories, special agents like, Christine and Virginia. But what's your feeling about why the stories, these two extraordinary stories in women, were just sort of forgotten among historians or record keepers or whatever? Why do you think they were so forgotten?
Well, I think with Virginia, there are many reasons. I mean, there weren't that many American women who were doing what she did. I mean, it was very unusual. And after the war, I think she was almost like an embarrassment to a lot of the men who helped set up the CIA. So even though she went to work for the CIA pretty early on, she was treated badly. It was if all those daring do things that she did was somehow a criticism of them. It wasn't her fault, but they had done a lot less than she had. She was a very unusual American in the sense that she had been there right way through the war, involved in everything, the real nitty gritty. She was an even more unusual American woman. And I don't think there's anyone quite like her from America in the history of the Second World War. So there's that, just her very being so unusual. But also, if you look at SOE, Special Operations Executive, which she worked for initially, something like 85% of those files were lost or misplaced or deliberately put somewhere where we can't see them. So a lot of the story was lost at that point. She had 20 or so code names, therefore very, very difficult to follow. When she went to work for the American counterpart, OSS, and I went to NARA, the National Archives in Maryland, and with a list of files that I'd been told were there, a lot of them weren't there. They were, they should be on this shelf or in this box, but they're not. And when I mentioned this to the CIA, the woman at the CIA sort of laughed and said, "Very Virginia." It was almost as if she was playing cat and mouse with me, even now, making it almost sort of super difficult for me to track down everything. I had this big map of France on my sitting room wall, little stickers and bits of cotton, trying to match up the code names and the missions and things. It was really, really difficult. I had two amazing pieces of luck, which is why I think it worked in the end. Quite near the beginning, I was in the National Archives in the UK in London. I was looking at some SOE files. A gentleman tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Can we speak outside?" So I thought, this is very strange, and went outside, and he spoke in riddles, but soon became pretty clear that he was a former intelligence officer who had seen what I was doing, was very interested in SOE, and said, "I can help you get some files declassified," which he did amazingly. He also, very, very luckily, had a friend who'd recently retired from the CIA, who I met at Starbucks and DuPont Circle in DC. I was the woman in the blue scarf by the window. It was all very exciting. And he too was really helpful. Look here, look there. I'll get you to talk to the CIA chief historian who up until that point had completely blanked me. So I had these two gentlemen who were really super helpful. And then also I found in the Resistance Museum in Lyon, which if you're interested in French resistance, I do urge you to go and see. It's extraordinary places where the Gestapo were during the war, so it has some pretty weird atmosphere there, but very, very interesting. And in a back room, under several inches of dust, was a whole treasure trove of letters and documents that had been copied before they got lost, but letters from people who had fought with Virginia, who had written to each other after the war, and had been collected by one of the members of the French resistance, who had initially, by the way, been very obstructive with her. Who is this foreign woman? Why is she giving me orders and things? But soon came to realize that she was the answer to all their prayers. They'd been fighting with broom handles and kitchen knives until that point, and then she got them organized and things. And he, almost as sort of an act of penance, had brought together all this material not long after the war, and then it had been forgotten, and I found it. And my goodness, that really did help. And 2 or 3 letters between them. So basically the same thing. And this is what really sort of touched my heart. And it was so emotionally and deeply felt. You could tell from the language. And they said in slightly different words each time, but very much the same thing. It had been worth being born just to have met Virginia Hall and to have fought by her side. So you can tell from letters like that, the impact she had, a foreign woman, foreign accent with a wooden leg coming in, ordering maybe 400 or 500 men around, very conservative country. Women did not take command of anything. They were expected by the Vichy government to stay at home and have at least 4 children as their patriotic duty. There she was, somehow persuading these men to fall in behind her and do what she asked as part of the entire war effort. And I thought that was her secret. There was a force of personality there, an integrity, a sort of a charisma that made these men do what she asked. And that was like this link. Finally, I felt like I was there on that plateau with them, with the parachute drops of guns and uniforms and all the rest of it. I felt it finally. And that was a really, really exciting moment. But it took quite a while to get there. But my goodness, it was great when I did.
A great hunch for both of you. Claire, what do you think about Christine and why the story took so long?
Well, again, I mean, there are a couple of very clear reasons. I mean, partly it's just because she seems to fall between the gaps. You know, every category she is distinct from it. So she was too Jewish for some people to consider her really Polish. She was too Polish to be really British, even though she worked for Britain, and ended her life as a British citizen, of course. She was too male, too masculine to be really feminine, and yet she was obviously too female to be male. You know, she falls between all of these things, and a lot of these women are quite hard to categorize. And that does have consequences. You know, in one of the other books I researched, The Women Who Flew for Hitler, I found that a lot of the men's papers had gone to the German National Archives, but the woman that I was looking at, her papers had been returned to the family after the war, marked as domestic, because obviously that can't have any relevance to, you know, whatever. So it literally hasn't been in the archive. So you're fighting at the level of they face prejudice in their day, but then the researcher also has to overcome these extra barriers to try and identify and pull together. But when you're researching a man, it tends to be more systematic. So that sent me out like Sonia. So I went to Poland, did a trip researching there. I was staying in the flat belonging to the son of one of her wartime colleagues in arms. And I came out one morning and I saw a Wehrmacht unit in the street, a Nazi German World War II unit. And I just thought that's ridiculous. So I kind of shut the door. Okay, got to get out there. So I went out into the street again, and they were still there, and they were quite angry. And one of them had a sort of handheld machine gun, which he started jabbing towards me. I was nearly in tears. It's the most terrifying experience of my life. And then my friend who was coming to translate ran around the corner. He said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't see when we arrived last night. It was late, but there's actually a poster on the side of the building saying, please don't come out between 8 and 10 in the morning because we're filming for a World War II TV series." And I just walked in and ruined a shoot. And in a sense, it was quite funny, but also it really brought home to me that the incredible blunt courage, because I was like complete jelly on the floor, whereas Christine actually was part Jewish, was a British special agent, was arrested by the real Nazi Germans more than once, and yet always kept her cool, unlike me, and talked her way out of trouble. So you have to go out, I think you have to go out into the field and try and find some of the traces of these women there, which obviously both of us have done. But also I think there's a specific reason why Christine's story has been hidden, and that's because just 7 years after the end of the war, Christine was murdered in her South London home. And because she didn't have any children, she didn't have family surviving, I was able to apply under the Freedom of Information Act and secure the documents. So I got the medical records, the police records, and the court papers, everything. And it was fascinating. Those hadn't been looked at before. So we know exactly what happened. But after that, I mean, for a moment, the story was all over the papers, and we know people like Ian Fleming read about it in the newspapers and actually was inspired by her. And we think that Vesper Lind, the first Bond girl, is based on Christine. In fact, her childhood nickname was Vesper, for example. And he was talking about Christine Granville in interviews to promote his first James Bond book. I mean, of course, she's much more than Vesper Lind. She's actually a real woman, and she's more Bond than a bloody Bond girl anyhow. But, her light was lit up for a moment there because of this tragic news. But very quickly, the story was covered up. And I discovered that Andrei Koversky, her colleague in arms with just one leg as well, who served with her in 2 theatres of the war. And he had actually coordinated a group he called the Society to Protect the Reputation of Countess Christine. And the idea was that they felt, to really to understand Christine's psychology. I mean, she was a woman ahead of her times. She had a very active love life, and this is part of who she was. It's just one part of her, but it is part of her. And they felt that the world wasn't ready for Christina in 1952, which is when she was murdered. And so I think, from the best of motives, they were trying to protect her reputation. Although we can also say that she had slept with most of them. She had also saved several of their lives, in fact, but most of them were married to other women. So perhaps there was more than one reputation that they were concerned about protecting here. In either way, the net result was that they prevented a number of books being written about her, and they prevented a film. There was going to be a biopic of her in the 1950s, like Carve Her Name with Pride. And in fact, Winston Churchill's daughter, Sarah Oliver, who was an actress, wanted to play her because she knew that her father said that Christine was his favourite spy at one point in the war. And they couldn't get the information because, of course, all the files were closed then. You couldn't go to the National Archives then and call up the files. And the gentleman refused to talk about what she had done and what had happened. So really, there wasn't enough information. Her story was hidden. But now I think it is, it's partly sexism. It's partly because the files have been misfiled a lot of the time. And I think it's a real privilege. It's been a real adventure for me to research this story, but it's been a real privilege. I think, Sonia, you feel like that as well. What an honour it has been to uncover the lives of these stories and let people know about them, let people be inspired about them and see the reality of what women did achieve in this war.
I totally agree, yeah.
And that's one thing that I also wanted to ask you both, if we had time, was just sort of take us, after the war. Virginia, tries to, what she does, she goes back to work for the CIA, she goes back to Washington, but yet it's not the war, clearly, though the Cold War is coming, and it's a little bit sad and disappointing, the sense that, there's not a role for her and there's not a respect for her as she comes back. And it sounds like that's sort of what was happening to Christine as well, that she just was at loose ends. So both of these stories very poignant as these women try to find a life after the war, even though they're part of the victorious allies.
Yeah, I mean, it just shows, I say in the book that valor rarely pays the dividends it should, and it certainly didn't with Virginia. She did go and work for the CIA. It took her a long time to get a job there, and then it's heartbreaking. Through a Freedom of Information Act request, a FOIA request, I managed to get a lot of her personnel, her HR files from the CIA. And you see these appraisals of her by men who are her senior in the structure at CIA, but much younger than her, with no track record in the field at all, describing her as unable to deal with pressure, unable to deal with a crisis, unable to come up with solutions for problems. Simply not true. And actually quite often she would rebut. You see her rebuttal and say, well, this is not true, this is not true, and this is not true. And then you'd find out that they hadn't in fact been in charge of her, but had been asked to write her appraisal without knowing what she did. And this wouldn't just be once, like a one-off mistake, but would happen, more than once. And she did have some supporters within the CIA, certainly, who talked about her being a, quote, sacred presence, but one who was really undermined and belittled because it was thought that she just didn't fit in. You didn't have women like that. She was a one-off. The CIA was man's business, and it wasn't for a woman with a wooden leg. Whatever she did in the war, that was kind of an irrelevance now. She did drink too much. I think she found life pretty difficult now. But there is one, thank goodness, there's one saving grace, which is that towards the end of the war, she, having been on her own for a very, very long time indeed, she met Paul. Paul was a French-American, not yet with American citizenship, but very keen to continue living in America, was very brave, was very good with her. He was shorter than her, he was younger than her, and he was her junior. He took her orders without question, but he also made her laugh. My goodness, she hadn't done all that much laughing for quite a long time. And her niece, who I met, this wonderful woman, Lorna Catling, who lives in Baltimore right now. We spent some time together in Baltimore, had a really lovely chat. And she said, you know, Paul lightened her life. So she'd seen such horrors during the war. She had lost so many friends. She had such guilt about some of the unbelievably brave young people she'd recruited who paid with their lives, and others who had gone to concentration camps, Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp, and others who came back shells of their former selves and never recovered. She had terrible guilt and remorse about that, but I'm not surprised that she drank a little bit too much, but Paul was there. Paul helped her. So there was something in her life that was joyous. They didn't have children. They thought about adopting at one point. So they got 6 poodles instead, and spoilt those poodles rotten. They were fed, if you can believe this, from a silver ladle. So I think she poured all her love into Paul, into the poodles, and into this rather wonderful French style house where she tried to make French style cheese with varying success, because several people complained about how smelly it was. So I'm not sure it was totally successful. But you know, the other day when I was last in DC, actually the other day, it's about 18 months ago now, so pre-COVID, and I met some people from the village where her house was, not far from DC, and they had been to a garage sale after her death and had bought a uniform that she had worn in the war, obviously not in the field, and there it was, and it was just great to see. And they hadn't known who Virginia Hall was. Virginia Hall loved her style inside. She had beautifully embroidered Virginia Hall, and then they heard about the book and they came to meet me with this uniform. So, you know, quite often things come out even after you've read the book, written the book, and that was a really cherished moment for me, actually, and meeting them and hearing their stories too about how they found the uniform.
I'd forgotten about Paul, but that's great. That's great.
Yeah, good old Paul. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Well, I think that's about it. I'm not seeing any questions. I think that we did such a good job of like adventure and, you know, history and all of it, but covering this. But I just want to thank you both so much. Fascinating stories, tremendous books, you know, great narrative, fascinating women. What a treat those of you who haven't read these books have in store for you. So again, Claire, thank you so much. Sonia, thank you so much. Really interesting. Hope you had a good rest of your evening, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Good night.
Good night.